Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I am the chief economist at American Compass. And today we are speaking with Congressman Jared Golden, the Democrat representing Maine's 2nd District in the House of Representatives. He is a fascinating and really impressive leader who has carved out a really valuable niche for himself, I think, as somebody in the Democratic Party who is still genuinely focused on his constituents in the working class, on worker interests generally. We've had the pleasure to work with him on a few different issues at American Compass. Of note here, he is the sponsor of the Built USA Act, which proposes a 10% global tariff. Those of you following the news lately may have noticed several mentions of that idea. So obviously this is front and center, and the notion that in fact there is support, at least from conservative Democrats, I think speaks to the long-term potential of that kind of policy. So really enjoyed talking with him about what brought him to the issue, how he thinks about this kind of tariff and trade policy generally, what's going on politically within the Democratic Party, and then especially valuable, I thought, just how this all plays with his constituents, what they actually care about, how they see that connecting to trade policy, and then where the rubber meets the road on local economic issues in a place like northern Maine, which obviously is not always front and center in our political debates. So enjoy that. But first, you must listen to me tell you, as usual, about Commonplace. In this case, the team has done a fantastic job pulling together a whole symposium on Liberation Day and everything going on as a result of that. Great pieces by Batya Ungar-Sargon, Nick Phillips, Henry Olson. We have a piece from me on what we do now that we do have a 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs, and more coming early next week. So head over to commonplace.org. And of course, if you had already been a subscriber to Understanding America, you would understand much of what is going on in this ongoing trade conflict, from the use of the reciprocal tariffs to the demands that we might be planning to make of our allies. I think we provide a good range of coverage. If anything, we may be a little overly tariff heavy. I'm trying to start writing more about other stuff too. But go on over to understandingamerica.co. You can find some of that other stuff in the archives. And of course, new stuff will land in your inbox every Monday and every Friday. But without further ado, here is Congressman Golden. And we are joined by Congressman Golden. Congressman, thank you so much for making time on what is obviously a very hectic week for everybody working on these topics.
It's really great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Oren. And like I was saying before we kicked it off here, they're all busy. Some are more interesting than others. So
yeah. Well, interested to talk about the interesting side of it. I guess maybe just start here. You of course had a bill already introduced in Congress proposing a global 10% tariff. I assume more folks are interested in that now. What has that been like in terms of who you're hearing from and just what sorts of questions people have, what they seem to be focused on?
I found when I introduced this bill last year, right, in the last Congress, and of course I reintroduced it this year. I found pretty quickly early on last year that there are people either in Congress or back home in my in the communities that I represent who are already supportive of tariffs or versions of them, or are supportive of the need to revisit free trade in general, and they're very pleased. They're excited that I am I'm with them on this, and that I understand what they think is really important about this. I didn't get a whole lot of criticism. I think that's a little bit different this year, right? I think that it has to do with the fact that we have our sitting president here, President Trump, who can be kind of polarizing for folks. And so a lot more people who are just adamantly opposed to this have been getting on me about this and really challenging me, particularly many of my colleagues.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk more about that, the sort of politics of this going forward. But maybe let's start kind of on the substance, I guess. Big picture, what got you interested in the issue? What made this something you were thinking you wanted to be working on?
Well, it's kind of an evolution for me, Oren, to be honest. Like, I've long been pretty skeptical of free trade deals, things like NAFTA. I've always considered myself a labor Democrat. I'm from Maine, particularly northern Maine, rural Maine. We've lost like 35,000 manufacturing jobs in this century, so in the last 25 or so years. So I think it's pretty natural that I would be skeptical of the trade deals like NAFTA or China's entry into the World Trade Organization. I grew up listening to certain types of Democrats warning about the dangers of this, but I never really associated this with tariffs at all. I feel like when I was younger and not very politically engaged, even though I was hearing this, and then even when I started to get into politics, tariffs just wasn't a thing that often got much attention. In my first term in Congress, 2018, 2019, I actually voted against the USMCA, and I still think that's not a good deal. We can talk about why if we have time. I think it needs to be revisited, so I'm glad that's going to be happening in the year ahead. But one thing that I also started to pay attention to was that in Trump's first round of tariffs, we saw a pretty decent economy in 2018, 2019. Wages were outpacing inflation, I think is one of the key points I would make up until about the time COVID hit and really disrupted the economy. But then when Biden came into office, I kept waiting to see the rollback of the Trump tariffs, and they never came. And in fact, in some ways they added to them, right? And did some industrial policy to try and complement that. So I started really paying a little more attention to like what's really going on with the tariffs here. And I started reading some books. I don't know if you've ever heard of William Greider. He wrote the book Come Home, America.
I've heard of him. I haven't read the book. I'm interested.
Very good book. He wrote that in 2009, I believe. He actually makes the case for a 10% tariff in that book in 2009, a universal one. And then I read Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen, someone who I've gotten to know and have read a lot of his books and articles. He's also pretty supportive of President Trump's approach on trade. And then finally, that led me to the internet where I was saying, well, who else out there is advocating for this? And I ended up finding American Compass, and that brings me right here with you today.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. It's always funny to sort of hear the very different ways that people come to this issue. I mean, I think, certainly on the right of center, there is those who really come to it from the China perspective. That's kind of what wakes them up, or there are those who come to it from, looking what's happened at deindustrialized regions. I think probably from the left of center, there are some of those commonalities. And then labor, of course, is such an interesting piece of it. Labor was really, if you look back at, who actually was raising the alarm bell in the 90s with China and the WTO, labor leaders have to be at the top of that list. Is that a factor for you in Maine? Is that something that, because I think the flip side is at this point, or until very recently, labor had really sort of stepped back from that and stopped pushing on that issue.
Yeah, I think more just when I was a little bit younger, before I was in politics, being around people who had manufacturing jobs and lost them, seeing communities that lost mills just be completely hollowed out. And then you start to get into politics, and now you're really grappling with these issues. It's 5, 10, 15 years later, you're still seeing these towns struggling. And to listen to people talk about the pain that comes with that, to hear them talk about how all basically the youth are leaving, the kids are gone, the school is struggling to even stay open. Those types of stories really, they got to make you, feel for people and understand what is at stake. So when I started to first run for office, that was in 2014, I was elected to the State House. Then I started talking to labor leaders. And even at that time, labor leaders and on the Democratic side, or actually, I often find that labor is all over the place, right? They are left, right. Some of them are they hate politics, right? but they were very vocal about the
Interesting.
ills of free trade. So
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on now. Then, obviously we have everything that President Trump announced on. Well, for Northern Maine, the Canada piece, I guess, even earlier was incredibly significant. Then everything announced on Liberation Day. Now some of the adjustments a week later. Obviously the 10% global tariff is a piece of it, but a lot else going on too. How do you analyze it? How do you sort of assess what he's doing overall and how the pieces fit together?
well, I'll go back to USMCA.
Yeah.
In my first term in Congress, I voted against that. Maybe an improvement on NAFTA. I thought that the Democrats were really focused on, new labor and environmental standards that would be applied against Mexico, and this would, make the standards of Mexican workers better, and therefore, they would be on a more even playing field with American workers. I was very skeptical that we would be able to enforce that, and I would stand by that today. I've heard from people that are basically saying like, yeah, go ahead, go down there and try and organize Mexican workers or see these standards enforced, and you quickly see that it's not working. But from my perspective, and I'm not necessarily saying this is bad, I know where it comes from, but the administration's priorities were kind of big ag in the Midwest, exports of their agricultural goods, pharmaceuticals, IP. And from the perspective of the losses we've suffered in Maine because of NAFTA, not much was in there that I thought was really going to change much at all, if anything, particularly as it relates to some of the problems that we have with Canada. So it just wasn't a good enough deal for me in my communities. This next go around, I'd like to see some things get fixed there, to pay more attention to the types of communities that have lost jobs rather than continuing to focus on the areas where we're already quite strong.
Yeah, the point about the Mexican labor standards is really interesting, and actually, until we've now seen what Trump is doing, I'd never thought about it this way. That for decades now, the argument has been, free trade is great, and if people point out the problems, like, well, how are American workers supposed to compete with Mexican workers with those labor standards? The answer is, okay, well, now we'll do an even bigger, more complicated agreement that tries to address all of that. And obviously we have not had success. The end result has been, the massive trade deficits, the hollowing out of American industry. And I guess one way to think about what Trump is doing is he's essentially saying, we care much less about the process side of it. We care about the result. The result is these massive deficits that are harming U.S. workers. So it is not a me problem, it's an us problem, or even a you problem, right? You, Mexico, don't tell us you've checked the boxes on complying with these standards. Fix the trade imbalance, and that's what we actually care about. This, of course, drives economists nuts because there are valid reasons to have trade deficits with particular countries as well. But I think what, certainly the administration's view and my view as well is that's all well and good, but we can also see where we have imbalances for very invalid reasons. And we haven't found another way to address them yet. How do you feel about the sort of threaten and negotiate approach? It's not something we've seen the U.S. do in a while. It's something you sort of, I guess, have to leave to the White House. You can't really have Congress threatening and negotiating as a body. What role do you want to see that kind of policy playing in moving trade forward?
Well, I guess first of all, I would say that there's a lot of fixation on Trump as the quintessential deal maker, the art of the deal. And, I'm not in any way saying that that's not what he is, but it's also not that unusual. Like people that I've talked to who sit around business tables and negotiate big deals, or people, who like work on Wall Street, they often say very similar things about tactics that you might use that can be effective. Everyone has heard about slamming the table or flipping the table. Sometimes I call it kicking the hornet's nest. People in politics understand this, and even in Congress, sometimes in order to get to some kind of yes, you got to start with a pretty strong no, and an explanation of why, and a clear explanation of what you need at a minimum. But if you're not willing to say no or say, well, I don't need to make a deal with you, then you'll get taken for granted.
Well, that's certainly a good description of what the U.S. position has been for roughly the last 30 years. Is we don't have any demands, and even if we do, we're not going to do anything if you don't meet them. And I think it's very funny when in various contexts, and this comes up on the defense policy side as well, when I think some people in the U.S. say, look at these other naive countries that don't take care of their national security, don't spend enough. But you could also look at it exactly in reverse, that they know exactly what they're doing. And it is we that have been naive for essentially accepting this state of affairs and thinking either that it is the best possible world or that we shouldn't kind of look out for what the American interest is.
Yeah, another thing I want to point out, Oren, here is that while I agree that there are countries who are, bad actors, their practices disadvantaging us, I often also look at this as about us and the choices we've made, the wrong choices from my perspective, whether that be political leaders, but also business leaders in the U.S., not making decisions necessarily that are best for America and for the American people, but best for making more money through almost any means. And so I think part of this for me is also about how do we change the calculus and the behavior, not just of another country like China or even some of our allies, but how do we change the calculus and thinking and the priorities or values of our own business interests, of our own business leaders, of our own political leaders.
Yeah, it's interesting you put calculus and values right next to each other, because in my mind those are exactly the two points of leverage in a sense, right? There's a world in which, well, even if we have the exact same economic circumstances, people will make better choices for the sake of the nation. The flip side, and I think this is where, this is the exact case for tariffs, is you can to some extent assume that, business leaders, hopefully they'll behave ethically, but they are going to go where the money is. And so you do change the calculus and you sort of, take it on, to take responsibility as policymakers to have a point of view on what is good for America, and that the laws that shape the calculus for business leaders have to affect that. What do you see as the role for Congress here, especially at this point, given how the administration has been acting? What do you want to see sort of let run versus where are you really hopeful that Congress is going to step up?
I think I would say that there are elements of President Trump's trade policy that Congress should make permanent. And so we should enact it into law. So why would we want to do that? We want to make sure that the benefits of tariffs that are going to take time to realize actually, and we end up seeing that, right? And that's going to take time. It's frustrating the way that people are looking for evidence that this is working like automatically. I've always known, as someone who put forward legislation to do tariffs, that this would be more of a long game, and that it requires some patience and some tolerance for a little bit of pain or disruption. So what would we want to do? Obviously, I'm the sponsor of the 10% tariff bill. I've worked with American Compass on that. I think that this will help us start to erase trade deficits and shift the landscape to favor more domestic production. I think that is the key goal right there. So that 10% ring fence, as it's been described, I think is something that Congress should look at and probably could get to yes on in a pretty bipartisan way. I I think that we all know that China is the kind of key competitor here. So we could look at elements of the president's, trade moves here having to do with China and make some of that permanent. And Congress has been talking about this for the entire 6 years I've been there. There's a growing bipartisan consensus that we have to be more aggressive in looking out for the United States, particularly when it comes to our economic and trade relations with China. So a good hard focus right there makes a lot of sense. Related to this, it's not getting a lot of coverage. It wasn't part of it ended up in Liberation Day, but it's something that the president's been talking about separately, is the erasing the de minimis loophole. We got a lot of lower level, very cheap goods just coming in, no tariffs, no taxes, even bypassing a formal customs process. And so while that's a big loophole that lets a lot of goods in and undermines American businesses, this is also tied to the fentanyl crisis. A lot of precursors coming in. If you talk to the federal law enforcement agencies that are trying to crack down on this is one of the biggest loopholes that they often bring up and say we have a very hard time getting into these bonded warehouses to inspect these packages, and we know there's a lot of the goods, the precursors coming in that then get used to make fentanyl. Usually we're talking about controlling borders to stop this issue, but here we have one with a trade nexus. And then, of course, the renegotiation of the USMCA, which was due anyways. And like I said, I'd like to see a different focus, as it relates to Canada, where I'm close to the Canadian border. I'd like to see some changes that have really, to address issues that have really disadvantaged northern border states and communities like that I represent. And I'm guessing across the northern border, there's a lot of agreement with me about that. What does that look like? I can tell you from experience talking to my constituents, like Canadian lobster industry, they fish a different part of the season. Right before our guys go out to start fishing, they dump a bunch of lobster into the U.S. market, plummeting the boat price. And then it takes quite some time to recover that price, at the dock, so to speak. And it's a big problem. It's one that happens every year. Our lobstermen almost joke about it, like we know that it's coming. We see the same thing with lumber. So I have sawmills, loggers, and there's just a lot of issues that we could try and address there. You've probably never heard of the gray zone. It's the only contested maritime border for the United States. And it's longstanding, goes all the way back to 1600s, 1700s. I guess I would say that this is an issue that the U.S. should prioritize in talks with Canada as well, to make sure that our fishermen have access to the waters that belong to the United States, and that we're keeping Canadian fishermen out of those waters.
Yeah. So I had no idea. We have a contested maritime zone with Canada.
Yes.
I feel like we should be definitely claiming that before we move on to Greenland. Maybe that could be
might be a stronger priority and starting place. There's a lot of like the competition has increased over time because that's where the lobster are going. Yeah. There's a lot of the value and catch is in that area, and as that has become more true, the competition between Canadian and Maine fishermen in that area is only increasing.
Interesting. I love to picture the lobsters sort of studying their maps and thinking like, well, if we can get to the gray zone, then maybe that would be better for them. But I mean, it's super helpful to sort of dive down to this level, because I think, certainly for the work that I do, talking about these trade issues typically is at the most macro aggregate level, hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars in flows, maybe some of the very largest multinational corporations and their behavior. But to your point, for probably I guess would be a majority of Americans who actually feel the impacts of trade policy, it comes in at these very local level issues in a lot of cases. I'm curious as both from where you're from and obviously as a representative for the people in that area, how where does the rubber meet the road on these kinds of issues for them? I mean, do you hear from them about trade as an issue? Do you hear from them about particular other countries, particular industries, or is it all just wrapped up in how's the economy doing?
Uh, for those people who work in these industries in my communities, whether it's fishermen, sawmill, owners or operators, loggers, uh, they talk about it a lot in regards to the disadvantages that they have with their counterparts across the border. Um, a lot of other people, I think it's just more about, well, how's the economy doing? Um, Different than like the manufacturing jobs we lost, a lot of them have to do with NAFTA, or some of them are fleeing down to the south, and then of course the south is losing them overseas to places like China or Mexico. It's a little different with Canada. Like, I think traditionally when people think of trade disadvantages, they think of capital pursuing cheap labor,
Yeah.
like going to China. With Canada, it's actually a little different. Like, Maine has seen a lot of our processing capability go to Canada. So whether that is competing sawmills or manufacturing facilities that are processing seafood, or for us as well, blueberries. Like, those businesses that once were in Maine went to Canada. Why would they go there? Well, their workers are going to get health care from the government. And because of that, they also have very low workers' compensation costs. So this is almost the opposite of like finding cheaper labor. Instead, it's a government that's providing, services to their people such that the business doesn't have to deal with that while ours are. So a different set of problems that we have to address. In some ways, more like some of the issues we might have with European countries.
Yeah.
So
That's
they
really
they want to
interesting.
see those things, fixed, or in some ways they might be advocating, well, if they're going to be doing that, then we need support from our government.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it again goes to the question of, okay, well, it's one thing to identify the problem, but then, what do you do about it? To your point earlier, some part of it is a question of how the US is conducting itself in all sorts of ways. And then to the extent that you have imbalances with these other countries, the main issue isn't that they have some explicit tariff on us or some law that says you can't buy from America. It is much more structural in the different systems. I'm curious to the extent that these the debates that are now playing out are followed and digested by your constituents. I don't know. You might just have to guess, or maybe you hear from folks. I'm curious, sort of, what arguments do or don't resonate, because you have on one hand most economists advancing a very, I'd say, theoretical argument that free trade ultimately is more efficient. Yes, you'll lose some jobs, but you'll get other jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the sort of very much more tangible arguments like you're making about, look at this specific problem. Does the philosophical side of things make its way down at all? Or do folks have a perspective on, well, actually free trade, broadly speaking, is going to be good for the country, or, no, free trade, broadly speaking, really has harmed us, or why that's the case?
I think I'll just lay out for you the different types of things that I am hearing from people,
Yeah.
and have been hearing either through the years or more recently. One is a lot of skepticism about the good jobs that were lost, higher paying manufacturing type jobs with good healthcare benefits, retirement benefits. When those jobs went away, a lot of economists and others said, don't worry, you're going to get other good jobs. You're going to get like service sector jobs, high tech jobs, whatever it may be.
Right. My favorite one is, I just saw someone saying free trade is great because the Nike shoe factory goes overseas and you get a job in Nike digital marketing instead.
Yeah, we've just never seen that come true for the most part in Maine. Maybe those jobs are getting created in America, but they're not being created in the communities who are losing the manufacturing jobs. So that's one thing I've heard consistently through the years. I will say that I hear a lot of people who are simply concerned about inflation and rising costs. And of course, everywhere they turn, there are economists, there are people and politicians. There is all kinds of stuff on the internet that basically just says, no matter what, if you pull back from the world, if you throw up tariffs, it's going to drive up the cost of goods. In other words, all these cheap goods, shoes, whatever it may be. By the way, we used to do a lot more shoes, boots, textiles in Maine. My grandfather worked at Knapp Shoe Company. I hear stories about that. Those jobs are gone. So sometimes I try and make the argument like, okay, so our goods might go up, the price of them, but don't forget about the better paying jobs that you'll also be bringing into a community. And you'll also be keeping your kind of value of money that's being spent circulating in your own community as well. So, we have to be a little more nuanced in addressing this issue of potential inflation that could come with these tariffs. I certainly, I've been hearing a lot lately about, even in Maine, where people are going, well, don't we have pretty good trade relations and balanced trade or near balanced trade with Canada? And if you look at a spreadsheet, that does appear to be the case. But if you really break it down, what you'll learn in our case is we're sending a bunch of our raw goods, whether it's timber or our lobster or our blueberries, we're sending them to Canada. They're doing the value-added manufacturing, processing, and then they're selling it back into the United States. And then we're basically balanced with Canada, in Maine anyways, because they're sending us a lot of oil. We're a very oil-dependent state. And that's a key vulnerability, where in this kind of trade negotiation or in a trade war with Canada, Mainers could get hurt. I will acknowledge that. We would have to make sure that we're addressing that with Canada and or finding a way to offset that. But at the end of the day, I just don't see it as balanced, even though it might look that way, in the balanced books. Because again, we're sending raw goods and then they're getting the value of refining those and sending that back into the U.S. market. And that leaves our folks, our sawmills and others at quite a disadvantage.
Yeah. So one more question on the kind of local side of it, and then I definitely want to spend a few minutes on the national politics of it. One question I think, or one challenge that folks from the free trade side of the argument will make is, either, well, why do you want these manufacturing jobs back? Nobody wants to work in your grandfather's shoe factory. Or, even if you bring the manufacturing jobs back, now these are going to be highly automated factories without a lot of people working in them. What is your sort of vision? What do you think success looks like in terms of what you'd want to see happening in your neck of the woods?
Well, I have a lot of people we're talking a lot about lumber and fishing here, farming. Don't know if you expect that, but these are the communities that I represent. I can tell you I have a lot of people right now saying, like, for those existing sawmills or seafood processors, others, they are saying, like, we're operating at 60, 70% capacity. We can go to 100 very quickly. 6 months, 12 months, that's jobs. And they are good paying jobs. And they are adopting new technologies using, AI and other things. That doesn't mean that there's some robot who's replacing an American worker necessarily. It's just changing the nature of the job. Also, in our farming communities, when I ask farmers, like, what could I do that would help you? A lot of times they say, like, there's no way for us to process anything here anymore. So now they're relying on long supply chains, having to send their goods, whether it's over, seas or to Canada or to other parts of the country. They would be much more competitive in the domestic market or the export market if they had processing capacity that no longer exists, unlike with the sawmills and some of the seafood processors. So I think that we could expect to, see some pretty quick results right there. But, I just don't buy this. I think that a lot of the jobs that did replace manufacturing jobs, they're not stable. They're not considered like careers. It's not really like a trade, not necessarily skilled. I think people find a lot of purpose in making something and being just really good at it. And that's true. If you go to a shipyard, we also build ships in Maine. I represent a lot of people that work at Bath Iron Works. They build destroyer ships for the Navy. We all know we're having a hard time building the Navy that we believe we need for our national security. Go talk to those workers about whether they think that manufacturing jobs in this day and age are not of high value, that it's not good work, purposeful work. Just, none of that is true in my experience. Is there such a thing as a bad manufacturing job? Yeah, sure. Go look at some of these countries that are paying people very poor wages. That's not what we want. But that's a false choice. We can do it different here.
No, that's fascinating. There are actually 2 points there that I hadn't really thought about. I kind of want to go run and write about as soon as we wrap up. So I really appreciate you raising them. One is the capacity point, because I think there's this idea that, we want to sort of step up production in the United States. Well, how long is that going to take to bring back build new factories in 3 years, 5 years? But you're right that there's enormous, I believe capacity utilization generally in our manufacturing sector has declined. Even if you just stepped up production in existing facilities, there's a, at least over the first year or two, enormous room to make progress, create jobs, start equipping people with more skills and so forth. And then I think the farming example is such a great illustration of the supply chain point, because usually, when I'm talking about the importance of supply chains, it's like, well, one reason, semiconductors are important is because you want the critical minerals or the high-tech components, and then you want the semiconductor packagers. But this is in some respects a better example that if a big processing plant, maybe it's highly automated, maybe it's only a few really good jobs, but it's not just about those jobs. It also completely changes the economics for the farmers in the community. And I think that's a really helpful illustration.
Absolutely, because they're operating on thin margins. And so shortening supply chains where they're not paying such high trucking, costs and other things like that, or just being able to deliver their goods to a more vibrant domestic market, like that's going to allow them to make keep more of their hard-earned money.
Right. All right. Have to talk politics before I let you go. There's obviously a ton of shakeup, I think, in our politics around some of these issues. I guess maybe starting on the Democrat side of the aisle, what do you see happening as Trump is taking these actions? Is there anything people are excited about? Are there things that, he could constructively be doing that would still accomplish his goals that Democrats would like better? What is the word on the street?
What an intriguing time. This political realignment that's being spoken often about of late, I think is real electorally. Maybe not so much yet accelerated in the halls of Congress quite yet. Although in my party, I think, unfortunately, it has a little bit more than on the other side of the aisle. So, like I said, it was Democrats in the 90s, early 2000s warning about NAFTA, warning about China coming into the WTO. I don't know if you've seen on social media lately this video of former Speaker Nancy Pelosi giving a speech on the House floor in 1996, almost sounding like President Trump today, juxtaposed with what she's saying now. Those debates in the 90s and early 2000s were often Democrats arguing with Democrats. Increasingly, Democrats are moving away from the labor side of this argument, now defending free trade deals, thoroughly against tariffs. And I think that's really just been a knee-jerk reaction to President Trump and the fact that he is the one that is now leading this movement. And that's really unfortunate. And I think it's bad for my party. There are some Democrats like me who understand these issues by virtue of the people that they represent. But even they are pretty close to unwilling to join me in saying, well, then let's try and work with the president on this. Even a little skeptical, in the aftermath of his first term when Biden is still supporting these things. That polarization has really driven Democrats, even those who used to be with me on these issues, away from it. Where it's like, well, we think that these things could be good, but it's always an excuse why we just shouldn't or can't work with President Trump on it. Simultaneously, I see a lot of Republicans who might say publicly, like, oh yeah, we're with the president on this, but you don't see much action.
Yeah.
There's not much meat on the bone. So, I think a point I would want to make is, in order for the president to be successful in the long term, he's got to find a way to try and reach out and make this bipartisan. Have a willingness to work with Democrats and Republicans who will join with him to try and enact some of these things, make them permanent. And I think that's so important. My biggest fear, because we've talked about how these changes will take time. So, my biggest fear is we go at this in the short term. We experience some of this disruption and pain, some of which we've seen in the last week. And then a new president comes in and undoes it all. And we don't see the long-term benefit. That's my biggest argument to the president, why he should turn to Congress, get a bipartisan coalition, and try and get aspects of this plan or this agenda put into law and show the world that we're serious in the long run, and also show our own, economy, our own business, leaders and people that are making decisions. You can count on this. This is where the United States Congress and the president are leading. So get behind.
Yeah, the long-term point is so important and one that we really harp on. Whatever our list of thoughts on what's going well, what's going not so well, what we would change, you have to make it permanent. You have to get to Congress. I think it's so important, not just because we worry, well, if another president comes in and reverses things, then we'll lose everything we've worked toward. But also because the business community is looking at that and saying, well, we're not going to do anything because that might happen. And, that the thing that determines whether somebody's going to make a big investment in the United States is not what is the tariff rate today. It's what is the tariff rate going to be in years 4 through 10. And if we can't give a credible, committed signal that this is what it's going to look like in years 4 through 10, then sure, you'll get some stuff around the margins, but you won't get that substantial reindustrialization and investment that obviously is so important substantively to the future of the country, but also is just important politically to validate the plan and help people see that even though there are costs, those costs are going to be worth it. And so, we are incredibly grateful for your leadership on this, and really hopeful that there will be forward progress.
Yep. Well, there are other aspects I'll just quickly try and touch on. While I'm supporting much of what the president's trying to do here with his trade agenda, there are elements that I see missing that I think are really important to the long-term success of the project. Personally, I think we need to support unions, make sure that any financial benefit in the long term is going to not just flow to the top, to the people that own these new manufacturing facilities, but that the wages are being broadly shared with the workers and producing wealth for the working class and in communities like those that I represent. I think you and I have had conversations in the past about my concern about what they might do with the tariff revenue. I would like to see it go towards supporting manufacturing in the form of subsidies or offsetting short-term struggles that might arise from higher prices for American families. We could think about what are the key goods that Americans need and families need to be healthy and well off, and we could put money into making sure that those prices are staying steady or even going down, also helping to make us more competitive. those are just a couple of the things. Things like the CHIPS Act, and I do see some resistance on the other side of the aisle. I think in part just because it was the Biden administration. Well, we want to repeal these things now. That would be the wrong move, while we're simultaneously, trying to change this trade paradigm.
Yeah, that's really important to highlight, that tariffs are a piece of the puzzle, but they can't be the whole thing. I think, the other one that we hear about and focus on, and I know you think about a lot too, is the workforce training and development side, because it has to work for workers, and even the businesses will say it's not going to work for the businesses if we don't rebuild what we've lost on that side. I know you have an enormous amount to go do today. It's incredible to think, given the pace over the last week or so, that this is still the very beginning of what is a very long-term project. But we really appreciate you making the time to talk, all the work you're doing, and looking forward to talking a lot more about it in the future.
Well, thanks again for having me on, and thanks to you and everyone at American Compass for working on these issues. I think it opens up a lot of room for bipartisan work. That's not the narrative. It's actually that this realignment is going, away from each other. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think you guys put out some really, really good, thinking, creative thinking, and I appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you. And we appreciate everything you're doing. Thank you again to Congressman Golden. And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.